Hello everyone, welcome to Storytime, and today you can see that we have a different scene on my special storyboard here. We are right at the end of our story of the Judges. Now, over the last few weeks we've been talking about Deborah, we talked about Gideon, we talked about Samson, and last week we would have learned about Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. Do you remember Ruth? When her husband died, she said to her mum, "Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your God, the living God, will be my God. Your people will be my people. And where you die, I too will die." And that was a lovely story. It's in the book of Ruth. And I told you last time that Ruth marries a man called Boaz. And they will have a child called Obed, and he will grow up, he will get married, he will have a son called Jesse, and Jesse will have 8 sons. And next week, I want you to remember Ruth and Boaz, and one of their sons will become a very, very special person. But we're not quite there yet. Because today I want to tell you the last story really that comes during the period of the Judges. And we can sum up the time of the Judges with everyone did what they felt like doing and didn't really follow God's instructions. And that was a very sad time. But we also see that there were some people that shone during that time, and they did love God, and they helped to become leaders to lead the people back to God. Well, today, let me introduce to you a man. This man is called Elkanah. Can you all say Elkanah? Fantastic. Well, Elkanah lived in what we call today Israel. He lived in the part at the bottom in the south of Israel, and he had 2 wives. Yeah, that was crazy, wasn't it? But in those days, sometimes they did have more than one wife. That's not a good idea, I don't think. And certainly the Bible doesn't encourage that either. But here's one of them. Her name was Peninnah. And Peninnah had lots of children. Elkanah had another wife as well. Here she is. Let's put her over here. Her name was Hannah. Hannah. Can you say Hannah? Hannah. Well, Hannah was a lovely lady, but she did not have any children. She wanted to have children, but she couldn't have them. And you know what used to happen? Peninnah would come to Hannah, probably when her husband wasn't around, and she would tease her, and she would be nasty and spiteful to Hannah. It's kind of like she was saying, "I've got children, but you haven't." Can you imagine how Hannah must have felt? It was really, really upsetting, heartbreaking for Hannah. Peninnah was so nasty to her. Well, over here on this side of the picture board, you will see the tabernacle. Can you remember? This is God's tent that God told Moses to build when they were in the desert. Well, now the tabernacle has been placed at an area in the middle of the country. And from time to time, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, all the people of Israel would go to worship God and to take offerings and pray to God at the tabernacle at the centre of the country. Now, let's put the man who was in charge of the tabernacle here. Here he is. His name is Eli. Eli. He was the priest at the tabernacle. And Eli had 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. You haven't got to remember their names, except I want to tell you that these sons of Eli were not good boys. They were bad. In fact, they too were priests, but they were corrupt priests. What does that mean? Well, it means that they used to do things that were really, really bad. They used to take stuff that wasn't theirs. They would abuse God's holy tabernacle. even by doing things with the women that was bad as well, that came there to worship. So they treated God's things badly. God was not pleased with them. He also was not pleased with Eli, their dad. Why? Because Eli, it seems from the Bible, knew what his sons were doing, but didn't do anything about it. God was not pleased about that. So there's a little bit of a lesson there, I think, isn't there? Well, let's carry on with the story, shall we? So this is the time where Elkanah and his family will go to worship God at the tabernacle. So off they all go. Here we are. Let's put them here. So Elkanah takes his wife. They probably take the children as well. And Peninnah goes, and so does Hannah too. And this was really hard because Hannah couldn't really keep away from Peninnah very much, and she would tease her and tease her. Now, this is what the Bible tells us happened. One day, I'm not sure where Peninnah was. Let's take her away for a moment. And we're not sure where Elkanah was, but we know that Hannah goes into the holy place, and she goes in, and Eli is sitting on a chair in the corner. So we'll kind of put him over here, shall we? And Hannah, I think she stood up, but she's kneeling down here. Hannah starts to pray to God. And she prays, she gets down and she prays to God. And her prayer is so well-meaning. It is so intense. She is praying, and Eli's watching her from a distance. And he can't hear her, but he can see that she's praying like this. And do you know what he thought? He thought Hannah was drunk. In fact, he got up and he went over to her and told her off. How wrong was Eli? She wasn't drunk. In fact, he said to her, how dare you come into God's holy place having drunk too much beer or wine? And Hannah said, sir, let's stand her up, shall we? Hannah said, sir, I'm not drunk. I've not been drinking beer. I've been praying to God. And this was my prayer. I prayed and said, God, if you will give me a son, a boy, then I will give him back to you to be a leader of God's people. Hannah realized that Israel needed a good leader. And you know, her prayer was that God would give her a son, and she would give her son back to God, to serve God. She was prepared to do that. Well, when Eli heard that, he said to her, may God answer your prayer. And the family went back home again, and time passes, and Elkanah is there, and Peninnah is there. And you know, the Bible says God answered. God answered the prayer of Hannah. He answered the prayer of Hannah, and she gave birth to a baby. And yes, he was a boy. And that boy would grow up, and here he is now. He's a little boy. This is Samuel. Can you all say Samuel? Okay, so Samuel grew up, and when Samuel was old enough to be left, do you know what Hannah did? She went back to the tabernacle. She met with Eli, and she left Samuel with him. And he would stay there, and he would grow up, and he would train to be a priest. He would be like a judge, but not yet, because he's just a boy. And he would grow in that holy place. Even though Eli's boys were still a bad influence, God kept Samuel safe. And you know what? Well, let me kind of tell you the next bit before we finish. We're going to take these away for a moment. It's now night time, and Samuel has been there for a little while now at the tabernacle. And look, here's Eli. He's in bed. Can you see him? And here's Samuel. He's in bed as well. And they were both asleep, and it's night time. And you know, all of a sudden, Samuel heard a voice, and the voice said, "Samuel, Samuel." So Samuel gets up, he goes over to Eli, and he says, "Eli, did you call me?" And Eli said, "No, I didn't call you, go back to bed again." So Samuel goes back to bed. While he's trying to sleep, he hears a voice again. "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel gets up, he goes back to Eli, and he says, "Eli, did you call me? I heard you calling." "I didn't call you, go back to bed." So Samuel goes back to bed. A third time, he hears his voice, "Samuel, Samuel." He gets up, goes over to Eli. Eli is now aware of what's happening. It's God that's speaking to Samuel. So he says to Samuel, "Samuel, listen, it's God speaking to you. Next time you hear that voice, say, 'Lord, speak to me, because I am your servant and I am listening.'" And that's what Samuel did. And God spoke to him. In fact, he spoke to him about the bad things that were happening at God's holy place. He spoke to him about the family of Eli. And you know, Samuel had to go and talk to Eli. Even though he knew all about these bad things, God wanted them to change. Well, do you know what? Samuel grows up. And this is the last bit. Here's Samuel now. He grows up. And he's now a young man. And he's now a leader in Israel. In fact, all the people at the top of the country and at the bottom of the country, they all knew that Samuel was a man of God. In fact, when Samuel came to town, they all came to him and asked if he had a message from God to them. And he was known from Dan, the country at the top, to Bathsheba, part of the country, right down in the south, as a man who loved God. Samuel was a great leader of God's people, right at the end of the Judges. Now, one day, the people came to Samuel, and they said, "Samuel, we want a king. We want a king." Can you all say this with me? We want a king. We want a king. Samuel said, "But God is your king." And the people said, "Well, we know God is our king, but we want a king like the Philistines, like the Midianites, like the Ammonites, like the Moabites. We want a king that we can see who will lead us into battle." Well, Samuel was sad that the people had asked for a king, because he thought they were rejecting him and God as their king. Next time, I'm going to tell you what happens when Samuel goes to God and talks to God about what the people want. I hope you enjoyed this story. See you next time.